I want to discuss the prospect of an EU-Mercosur agreement within the framework of two strategic factors. First is the global food crisis, which is our topic today, but also want to get into Communist China's efforts to refashion and dominate the liberal international system, because that negatively affects the global food supplies. Last week, we learned from the International Monetary Fund that 345 million people from 48 countries are in danger of acute food insecurity and what has become the worst food crisis since the global financial meltdown back in 2008. The managing director of the IMF warned that, quote, more than 828 million people go to bed hungry every night. I think those numbers are maybe inflated, but there's no denying the gravity of the crisis. The Mercosur countries figure prominently in this crisis because they are some of the most prolific food producers, as Professor Regunaga has shown us in his remarks. And we are seeing the negative political impact that high prices, food prices, are having around the world. We've seen the financial collapses of Sri Lanka in Asia, Zambia in Africa, and we have a dozen more countries that are on the verge of default, including Argentina, a Mercosur member. And throughout Latin America, we have seen a wave of left-wing populists recently gain political power. Most recently in Brazil, it's Latin America's largest population and its largest economy. We'll see a runoff election later this month that could see Mercosur's linchpin member follow suit in that red wave. In my own opinion, what makes this food crisis so frustrating, and especially based on my experience back at USAID, is that it was avoidable and is avoidable. Government policies of both the advancing but also developing countries are interfering with food markets to their detriment. A key question that I think we should ask about the agreement is whether it can catalyze adoption of free market policies that would encourage rather than discourage stable, plentiful, and less expensive food. If I could just briefly cite 5 what I consider to be anti-food policies that worsen the food crisis and should be immediately liberalized. The first is ending mandates to make biofuels from crops. In 2020, over 3 million tons of wheat and 6.5 million tons of corn were used as biofuels in the EU. The US government has similar mandates as well. And I looked back at past studies going back to 2007, and those show that biofuels cause world hunger. We know this, and yet these policies continue. The second is we need to end pressure on the banks not to finance clean natural gas projects. I understand the climate issues and concerns, but natural gas is the key ingredient in nitrogen fertilizers. So the drop in natural gas production spikes its price and that of fertilizers, 70% of the cost of which is natural gas. So expensive fertilizers in turn have spiked food prices, and poor farmers in the developing world have ceased using them with catastrophic drops in crop yields. The third is the ending the promotion of organic over conventional farming. Despite its popularity, and I don't dispute that, I buy it myself, in the West, organic farming produces about 1/3 less food, requires 78% more land, and costs 50% more. I mentioned Sri Lanka earlier in its financial crisis and failure to pay its debts. Went all in the organic farming, and this led to crippling food shortages and eventually its financial collapse. I think it's time for the West to ease these mandates and allow farmers, especially in poor countries, to produce more food as the market, not the government, mandates dictate. And lastly, I think we need to end export and import restrictions on food that lead to shortages and higher food prices, and that particularly harm low-income countries the most, and then in turn cost Western donors billions in food aid as compensation. Mercosur countries are guilty of this practice, but Europe overprotects its farmers. US, we have similar problems as well. It is the market that is the best manager of supply and demand. let it do its work. So if the EU-Mercosur agreement addresses these obstacles to food production, it will enhance stability in global food supplies, enhance prices to the benefit of those most vulnerable to food insecurity. Now, if I can address China, this is very important. China is, first of all, a massive food hoarder. And even prior to Russia's aggression against Ukraine, China's food stockpiling was responsible for historically high food prices. I looked at our U.S. Department of Agriculture, and according to their figures this past summer, China held 69% of global corn stocks, 60% of rice stocks, and 51% of wheat stocks, despite being 20% of the global population. This practice is not new. Beijing has consistently pursued a unilateral approach towards feeding its billion-plus population without any regard to others in the global community. As a result, China's food hoarding, poor countries find it difficult to access food, much less be able to pay for it. Second, over the past several years, we've seen Chinese state companies making massive purchases of foreign agricultural land, including in the Mercosur zone, which already exports most of its food production to China. In the United States, these purchases have prompted a rare moment of political bipartisanship in our Congress to examine the threat that this represents to our own food security. We know that food production from these lands will all be exported only to China and remove millions of acres from global markets. And this situation is made even more troubling given Communist China's increasing global belligerency and practice of leveraging its international loans for political gain. I think all of us are pretty familiar with the extent to which Africa has been captured by Chinese state lenders. Latin America is not far behind. 25 of 29 Latin American countries participate in China's Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI. Since 2005, China's state-owned banks have loaned those countries $138 billion, while other Chinese entities have invested another $140 billion. 50 billion of these loans are held by Brazil and Argentina alone, with another 75 billion in investments. China-Latin America trade was 12 billion in 2000, and in 2020 it went up to 315 billion, and is expected to reach $700 billion in 2035. So I think we need to be frank with ourselves. China is winning. And just let me take Uruguay as an example. In 2016, it signed a strategic partnership with China, one of 10 Latin American countries to do that. And 2 years later, it joined China's Belt and Road Initiative. In 2020, Uruguay joined China's Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And just this past July, it signed a free trade agreement with Beijing. China is Uruguay's largest trading partner, as are many countries throughout Latin America. 80% of Uruguay's soy production is exported to China. 90% of its total exports to China are food related. To finish with my remarks, I just want to say that it's my view that it's a strategic imperative that the West economically lock in developing countries before they are financially captured by China. Europe, but also the United States, must offer Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, and Uruguay, the 5 members of Mercosur, a clear, unencumbered, and bold pathway that links freedom and democracy to trade and investment as an alternative to Beijing's totalitarian and mercantilist and exploitative model of economic development. That, in turn, will help to stabilize current and future global food markets. There is no more time to delay. Thank you.